Back in high school and college, I weighed about 250 pounds and was always the biggest guy on my football team. Being the big guy had its perks on the field, but everything changed at the beginning of my junior year. I had a career-ending knee injury, and that was it, no more football for me. I had to pivot, so I threw myself into my studies, graduated with a degree in accounting, and never looked back. My name's James, and now I'm an accountant. Life turned out pretty good for the most part. I bring home a solid paycheck, have a beautiful home, and my wife Sarah loves me. So, what's the problem? Well, let's go back to my weight. Remember how big I was in school? That didn't change. By the time I hit 35, I was in what was supposed to be the prime of my life, but I had ballooned to nearly 430 pounds. I was a walking heart attack, just waiting to happen. Sarah had been on my case about it for a while, pushing me to do something about my weight. I try a few things here and there, but none of it stuck. I half-heartedly jumped on every fitness plan and diet she threw my way, but nothing worked. I cut carbs, but just replaced them with more meat. The result? I kept gaining weight. It got ridiculous. I was eating like an entire cow each day. In hindsight, I probably would have been better off just sticking with the carbs. And all that red meat? My blood pressure was through the roof. Then one night, everything changed. Sarah and I were, well, being intimate, and I just gave out. My body collapsed on top of her, and she couldn't breathe. I'll never forget the panic in her eyes. We ended up having one of our usual arguments about my weight, only this time it took a turn. She told me that until I lost at least 50 pounds, there wouldn't be any more intimacy between us. That hit hard. I didn't say much, I just left the room, grabbing a pillow and blanket before heading to the guest room. I slept there that night and left for work early the next morning, hoping the whole thing would blow over like most of our arguments. But it didn't. When I came home, Sarah had gone online and found me a boot camp for weight loss. She told me she was tired of being married to the fattest guy in the neighborhood, and that it was embarrassing for her. That stung, but I couldn't deny the truth of it. She handed me a brochure she'd printed off the internet. It was a month-long camp, and she said it would probably be the best thing for me. I stared at the flyer for a while before finally picking up the phone. I made the payment right there and then, booked my spot, and started packing. Sarah seemed surprised that I was actually going through with it. "Are you really going?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. I didn't answer, I just headed to the bedroom to gather some clothes and a few things. "It'll be good for you," she said, following me to the door. "You'll lose some weight, be healthier, and you'll feel better. The month will fly by. I'll call you every day." On my way to the guest room, she added, "We're not mad at each other, right? Why are you sleeping in there?" I turned back. "You said we weren't going to sleep together until I lost 50 pounds. "I said we weren't going to be intimate until you lost it," she corrected. "I didn't mean for you to sleep in the guest room." I think she realized then that her words had hurt me more than she intended. She was trying to make amends, but at that moment, the idea of getting away from home for a while felt like the best decision I could make. In the days leading up to my departure, I informed my team at work that I'd be traveling, but reassured them I'd still be working remotely. My performance wouldn't be affected. When the day finally came, I packed up my things, climbed into my car, and drove to the airport. I flew out to Tucson, to the dry heat of the Arizona desert, ready to start the boot camp. The first 3 weeks were rough. I didn't dive headfirst into the fitness program like I should have. Instead, I spent most of that time setting up my work systems, getting my internet and computer in place so I could keep up with my job while I was there. But as the second week rolled around, I started paying attention to what was going on at the camp. I began to notice the other people there, each of them dealing with their own struggles. It wasn't just about losing weight anymore, it became about something bigger. I say viewing because I wasn't exactly participating in anything. I was more of an observer, watching from the sidelines and laughing at the ridiculous things they expected us to do. When it came to the food, well, I treated the meals they served as appetizers. After all, you can't expect someone like me to survive on those tiny portions. So, I would order pizza or burgers and have them delivered. The delivery drivers even got to know me pretty well. They'd get a bigger tip if they met me on the access road where the campers went jogging. I'd sit at the picnic tables, enjoy my greasy feast, and then head back to camp as if nothing happened. After nearly 3 weeks of this, you might wonder how much weight I lost. Well, it wasn't exactly the result you'd expect from a weight loss camp. I had gained 6 pounds. That's right, gained. I was actually 6 pounds heavier than when I'd arrived. It was almost impressive in a way, but I didn't worry too much about it. Then, everything changed with a single text message. It was from Steve, an old friend of mine. Steve had just gone through a messy divorce about a year ago and was finally getting his life back on track. He wasn't ready to settle down again but was enjoying his freedom, dating around, and just having fun. He sent me a message saying he'd been out on a date with a woman who was way too young and wild for him, and while they were at the club, he thought he'd seen Sarah, my Sarah, with another guy. At first, I brushed it off. Sarah wouldn't be out with some random guy, not like that. But Steve knew me too well. He sent a few pictures he had taken, just to prove it. And there she was, Sarah, my wife, out with a guy I'd never seen before, letting him put his hands all over her. I recognized the necklace she was wearing immediately. It was the one I'd bought her when we were in Mexico the year before. There was no mistaking it. That text message hit me like a freight train, and from that moment on, my entire reason for being at the camp changed. It wasn't just about losing weight anymore. It became about reevaluating my entire life. I spent the next day reflecting, taking stock of where I was and what I wanted to change. I realized that, while I was a nice guy and had a good life, there were things that needed to be fixed, starting with my weight and self-image. The next morning, I walked into the camp office and sat down with the director. I told him I was serious about changing my life. I signed up for the 3-month intensive program, the one reserved for people who were borderline morbidly obese. I wasn't quite there, but I felt like I needed something drastic. There was no more playing around. That same morning, I joined one of the training groups for a walk in the desert. It was only 2 miles, and at a very slow pace, meant to kickstart our metabolisms and burn some calories before breakfast. The irony wasn't lost on me. Back in high school and college, I used to run 4 miles a day, easy, at a fast pace. But this walk had me struggling by the halfway point. It was my wake-up call. I realized how far I had fallen from the athlete I once was. I wasn't that big, toned football player anymore. By the last stretch of the walk, I could barely keep up. To make matters worse, 2 ladies in their 50s passed me, offering words of encouragement as I lagged behind. They told me I was doing great, but I couldn't help but feel a little humiliated. When I finally made it back to camp, I was drenched in sweat, my knee, once injured playing football, was throbbing, and I could barely walk. As I entered the cafeteria, some of the people I had befriended at the camp called me over. They were just as shocked to see me all sweaty and worn out. The truth was, we were all a bunch of scammers. None of us had been taking the camp seriously. But things had changed for me. I went to a small table in the back, alone. If I was going to do this, I couldn't afford any negative influences. For breakfast, I had half a glass of orange juice, a piece of toast, half a cup of fresh fruit, and 2 slices of low-fat turkey bacon. It wasn't much, and I was still hungry when I finished, but for the first time in years, I had truly committed to changing my life. It wasn't just about the weight anymore. It was about regaining control of my future, my confidence, and myself. We had about an hour to ourselves before the first workshop of the day, and I knew exactly what I had to do. I didn't like it, and I certainly wasn't looking forward to it, but I needed answers. I called a private investigator, hoping to dig up some information about Sarah. I needed to know just how far things had gone with that guy, and if there were others. It wasn't something I wanted to face, but I loved her, and if there was any chance of salvaging our relationship, I had to know the truth. Depending on what the investigator found, maybe we could move past this. As I headed to the workshop, I decided to really listen for the first time since I arrived. The speakers they brought in were former campers, people who had lost significant weight and managed to keep it off. Their stories resonated with me. Many of them said they'd struggled with their weight for years, but something had finally clicked, a moment, a person, or an event that gave them the focus they needed to change their lives. As I listened, I realized that discovering Sarah had been unfaithful was my incident. But I also realized that this change wasn't for her, it was for me. Throughout high school, college, and even after, I never really needed to look at myself. I always had someone, and since meeting Sarah, I didn't feel the need to question much. But now, the thought of losing her had forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths. I needed to make changes in my life, not just for Sarah, but because I owed it to myself. Almost as soon as the workshop ended, my phone rang. It was Sarah, making her usual daily call. I hadn't spoken to her in the past 2 days, ever since talking to Steve. I had been too hurt to even pick up the phone. "Hi, honey. Where have you been? You haven't answered my calls, and I've missed you so much," she said, her voice a mix of sweetness and concern. "I've been trying to juggle work and losing weight," I replied, keeping my tone flat. "It's been tough." "Don't worry, you'll be home in 2 days, and all this will be behind us," she said, trying to reassure me. "No, Sarah. I haven't lost 50 pounds yet, so I'm not coming home," I told her, matter-of-factly. She hesitated for a second. "James, that 50-pound number. It was just something I said when I was upset. I miss you. I want you to come home. I don't care if you've only lost 2 pounds. What matters is that you're trying, and I can see that now. You don't have to stay there. You can lose weight at home just as easily." "No, Sarah. A deal is a deal. I'm not coming home until I've lost at least 50 pounds. Maybe more," I said, my mind replaying something she had said earlier. I got what I wanted. What she wanted, or rather, who she wanted. She sighed, frustration creeping into her voice. "You're being stubborn. You can do this at home. Besides, I've been thinking a lot, and I really want you to come back." I took a deep breath. "Sarah, my mind is made up. It's hard enough to focus on work and weight loss at the same time, and I need to fully immerse myself in this lifestyle to get results. We'll have to talk less for now. I'm doing this for both of us. I don't want you to feel embarrassed by me anymore. I realize how hard it must have been for you, being with someone like me all this time." There was a long pause before she replied, her voice softening. "I never should have said that. I was just angry." I didn't respond. I hung up the phone, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. I changed into some sweatpants and a sweatshirt, ready for our morning exercise class. For once, I didn't hang back in the shadows. I went to the front of the line. I was done hiding. The trainer that day was Debbie, a tough, no-nonsense woman who had barely acknowledged my presence since I arrived. I'd noticed her sneering at me a few times, but she had never spoken to me. Not even as I lined up at the front that morning. But this time, I was ready. Ready to face whatever came next. She stared at me like she was trying to use the sheer force of her gaze to push me away, as if that would save her from the sight of me. We began with stretches and reach exercises. Not only could I not touch my toes, but I struggled just to reach my knees. Still, I gave it everything I had. We hadn't even finished the warm-up, hadn't done a single real exercise yet, and I was already drenched in sweat. Then, the real embarrassment kicked in. We started with light leg lifts, supposed to bring our knees up to waist height. By the time we were done with those, I was swimming in sweat, and Debbie, oh, Debbie, was looking at me with that smug glint in her eyes, an evil little smirk tugging at the corners of her lips. We moved on to arm lifts, and she kept us at them until I physically couldn't keep my arms up anymore. But I didn't stop trying. Next, we got down on the mats for even more humiliation. Back in my prime, I could bench press over 200 pounds, but on this day, I couldn't even do a single push-up. The best I managed was one push-up on my knees, and even that ended with me collapsing into a heap on the mat. Debbie's smug, triumphant expression was burned into my mind as I slunk away to the locker room, utterly defeated. I took a long shower, trying to wash away the shame before lunch. After lunch, we had another hour of downtime, so I headed to the clinic to get my knee checked out. Turns out, I had a slight strain, and they wrapped it up for me. The morning's exercise had pushed my muscles harder than they'd been worked in years, maybe ever. The doctor told me to ice it for a couple of days, but assured me I'd be fine. I could still walk on it the next day, but he warned me not to overdo it. That set the pattern for my first week. I stuck strictly to the meals they served, turned down dessert, and only allowed myself snacks when I was absolutely starving. The first 5 days were pure hell. I knew people were laughing at me behind my back, cracking jokes at my expense. I could feel their eyes on me, the whispers that followed as I shuffled around camp. But after the 3 weeks I'd already spent there, I probably deserved it. By the end of that first week, though, I was proud of myself. I had lost 8 pounds. That was also the week I received my first report from the private investigator. He had pictures. Some were of Sarah, my wife, at a restaurant with the guy she'd been seeing. There was even a recording of one of their conversations. The most damning evidence, though, were the pictures of her walking into a motel room with him, and based on the time they spent in there, it was painfully clear what they were doing. But oddly enough, it wasn't the fact that she slept with him that hurt the most. No, what really crushed me were the things she said about me behind my back. In one of the recordings, the guy asked her what finally made her decide to give him a chance after all the months he'd been pursuing her. I had never heard about this, so she'd clearly been hiding things from me for a long time. Apparently, they had known each other since college, but hadn't gotten together until recently. She told him she was tired and embarrassed by me, that I was so out of shape I couldn't even satisfy her anymore. That's why she'd sent me off to this camp, to get me out of her way so she could try out a real man. Then, she asked him how he managed to keep their affair hidden from his wife. He laughed and told her that, like her, he wore the pants in the family, and his wife did whatever he told her to do, without asking questions. Hearing all this was the final straw. The pain of betrayal was unbearable, but worse than that was the realization that there was nothing left of our marriage worth saving. My decision was made. In my second week of real training, I threw myself into it even harder. I picked up the pace during the morning walks, started swimming laps in the afternoons, and even signed up for some skill-building activities like archery and fencing. I knew I needed hobbies to keep myself occupied once I left the camp. And I wasn't just working on my body anymore, I was preparing for a new life. I also hired a good divorce lawyer. I told him everything, explaining how I'd uncovered Sarah's affair and providing him with the private investigator's reports. I wanted to make sure he was ready for anything that came next, because I wasn't just going to let her walk away unscathed. That was the beginning of my transformation, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. I was starting to rebuild myself from the inside out, one step at a time. I had told him to get the papers ready to serve, even though I still had no clear end in sight. By the time I finished my first month of real training, though, I felt like a completely different person. Or maybe I was closer to being the man I once was. I'd shed almost 40 pounds, and I hadn't felt this good in years. My whole routine had changed too. Instead of the lazy morning walks I used to take, I was now getting up early and jogging 3 miles before breakfast. Debbie's exercise class, which I never used to look forward to, was different too. She didn't seem to look down on me anymore. In fact, she'd started smiling at me, even greeting me in the mornings. That was a shock in itself. But the biggest surprise came one morning during class, as I was grinding out push-ups. I had just hit my 10th one out of a set of 15 when I suddenly felt this unexpected weight pressing down on my back. I gave it everything I had, managed to push through for another rep, and when I looked up, there was Debbie, adding some extra resistance to test me. I couldn't believe it. It was like she was finally acknowledging my effort. Even though I was staying at the camp, I was able to handle most of my work remotely, which gave me more time to focus on myself. I had also started taking stock of my relationships during my daily meditation sessions. What had started as an effort to motivate myself to lose weight quickly turned into a deeper reflection on the people in my life. I came to a hard realization: a lot of people hadn't been laughing with me over the years about my weight, they'd been laughing at me. By the 6-week mark, though, things were slowing down. My weight had hit a bit of a plateau. I had lost just over 60 pounds, but the rapid progress I'd been making, around 1 to 1.5 pounds a day, had slowed to a crawl. I remembered back in high school when my coach would make us do 2-a-days if we showed up for preseason out of shape. So I added a second, longer run to my daily routine. It wasn't easy, my knees and age definitely weren't what they used to be. But I pushed through it. Each day, I managed to go a little farther. If I still had any energy left when I got back, I'd hit the gym for some light weightlifting. Nothing too intense at first, I was just relying on muscle memory from my younger days to get me through. But it was embarrassing. After years of boasting to people about how I could bench over 200 pounds, I found myself struggling with 100. And even when I made progress, it wasn't consistent. One week, I'd get the weight up, and the next, I wouldn't be able to lift it again. My legs were even worse. The old knee injury was holding me back from doing squats or any heavy leg work. Any exercise that required me to stand for long stretches was limited by how weak my knee joint had become. Still, I slowly improved. But there was something else that wasn't healing: the pain in my heart. No matter how much weight I lost or how strong I felt, that emotional burden just lingered. One night, I was pushing myself at the gym again, trying to bench 170 pounds. The first rep went up smoothly, and even though I struggled with the second, I stupidly decided to go for a third. But the bar got too heavy, too fast, and I couldn't push it up. I was stuck, desperately trying to think of how to wriggle out from under the weight, when I felt someone grab the bar. Together, we managed to rack the weights back up. "Really smart, James," Debbie's voice cut through the silence. "You barely made the second rep, so why on earth would you think you could handle another? You do know it's against camp policy to be in the weight room alone, right? Do you understand why now?" I felt my face flush with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, Debbie. It won't happen again. And thank you for saving me. I know this is probably just another thing for you to laugh about, so go ahead, have fun telling everyone." But to my surprise, she didn't laugh. She just shook her head, gave me a half-smile, and walked away. It was the first time I realized maybe she wasn't here to mock me after all. It was one of those days where nothing seemed to go right. Debbie had given me an earful the day before, making some snide comment about how she had to help the fat slob yet again. I didn't even bother responding. I just turned around and walked away. If she had anything more to say, she kept it to herself, letting me leave in peace. The next morning, I figured I'd shake things up a bit. After breakfast, I started exploring the camp's workout rooms, trying to find something different, maybe another group I could join. There was a yoga class going on, and next door, a Pilates group was working through their routine. Neither really appealed to me, but then I saw a step aerobics class. It looked fun, fast-paced and filled with people, mostly women. There were maybe 1 or 2 guys in the whole room, so I figured, why not give it a try? Just as I was about to step in, I heard someone call my name. "I'd be really hurt if you went in there, James." I turned around and saw Debbie standing behind me, dressed in her usual workout gear, staring me down with those intense gray eyes of hers. "Why don't you come to my class today, like you always do? Then, after class, I'd like to talk to you. Tomorrow, you can do whatever you want. Deal?" She held out her small hand, and before I knew it, I was nodding and taking it. I followed her back to her usual room and went through another one of her grueling classes. Afterward, as I was toweling off, she looked at me and said, "Take a shower and meet me back here in half an hour." 30 minutes later, I was standing outside the workout room, waiting for her. I wasn't sure what to expect. Maybe she wanted to lecture me again, maybe about the dangers of working out alone, how it violated camp safety rules, or some other nonsense about how I could get kicked out. At that point, it didn't really matter. Nothing she could say would be worse than the news I'd gotten that morning. I had heard from the private investigator I hired. He told me that Sarah, my wife, had brought the guy she'd been seeing back to our home the night before, and they spent the night together. The thought of it still gnawed at me. I was stewing over how to deal with Sarah when Debbie showed up, snapping me out of it. Now, Debbie's tough, a no-nonsense drill sergeant in the gym, but she's also easy on the eyes. She's probably in her early 50s, with jet black hair and these piercing gray eyes. My favorite thing about her, though, is when she turns to look at the class over her shoulder, and her hair falls to one side, covering half her face, leaving just one eye peeking out. It feels like that single eye is looking straight into your soul, daring you to push yourself harder, to make one more rep than you thought you could. Debbie isn't built like a supermodel, but she's got a figure that gets attention. Her chest, while not huge, is more than enough to turn heads, and let's just say her classes are popular with the guys at the camp for more than just the workout. And then there's her butt, tight and firm. The camp rumor was that she could probably bounce a quarter off it. Some people even speculated she was a lesbian, but it didn't stop anyone from signing up for her classes. When Debbie finally showed up that day, she looked completely different. She wasn't in her usual workout gear. Instead, she was dressed in a loose-fitting sweatshirt, jeans, and big sunglasses, with her hair pinned up on top of her head. I was used to seeing her in tight, athletic clothes, so this casual outfit threw me off. On any other woman, it would have been a normal Saturday look, something you'd wear to run errands or do some yard work. But on Debbie, it made her seem almost vulnerable. It was a side of her I hadn't seen before. She smiled at me and nodded toward the exit, signaling for me to follow her. I was confused. I thought we were going to talk inside the gym, but she had something else in mind. "Relax, James," she said as we walked outside. "You're not in trouble, and I'm not going to lecture you. I just wanted to have a real conversation, and when I need to clear my head, I get in my Jeep and drive out into the desert. It helps me think, makes everything feel better by the time I get back." We walked toward the parking lot, the warm desert air hitting our faces as we left the building behind. The truth was, after everything that had been going on with Sarah and my own struggles, a drive in the desert didn't sound like the worst idea in the world. I had thought I was finally getting a handle on my life, or maybe everything just didn't seem as overwhelming as it had before I left. Perhaps it was stress relief, or maybe I was just learning to put things into perspective. Whatever it was, it felt like I was moving in the right direction. But then she dropped a bombshell that made my heart sink. "James, whether you know it or not, you've become a problem for me." Great. Just what I needed, another complication in my life. I had enough on my plate without worrying about some woman resenting me. She led me out to the back, where a black Jeep Wrangler awaited us. I climbed in, gripping the handle as she slammed the door and sped off. The tires kicked up gravel as we barreled down the highway. After a few moments, she veered sharply onto an unmarked dirt road that I would have completely missed if I hadn't been paying attention. We tore through sparse trees and bushes that gradually thinned out until we were surrounded by the stark beauty of the desert. The arid, sandy landscape stretched endlessly before us, eventually giving way to mountains on the horizon. She switched the Jeep into four-wheel drive and slowed down as we navigated the bumpy terrain. It was clear she knew where she was going, so I held on tight. Finally, we reached the edge of a medium-sized canyon. She engaged the parking brake, hopped out, and wandered over to the edge, gazing into the vastness below. It seemed like she needed a moment to gather her thoughts before she turned to me with an intensity that made my stomach flip. "James, what the hell is going on with you? When you first arrived, you were just another spoiled rich kid who didn't take this place seriously." "I didn't take you seriously. You had your conference calls, your late-night pizza runs, and you hung out with all the class clowns. We see about 100 guys like that every year. They come here overweight and out of shape, lose a few pounds, and go back home bragging about how tough it was. Some even make a ritual out of it, coming back every year." She paused, her gaze piercing through me. "But then something changed. I don't know why, but you became different. The first day you showed up in my class and stood right up front, I thought you wouldn't last 10 minutes. I even tried to get rid of you, but you gave it everything you had. You left that first class dripping with sweat, and I was sure the change wouldn't stick. But I was intrigued." Her words washed over me, and I could hardly believe what I was hearing. "Over the past few weeks, I've watched you undergo an incredible transformation. You've lost a significant amount of weight and gotten yourself into fantastic shape. You're at the point now where you're barely overweight at all. You don't even look like the same man who came here." That was an unexpected twist, almost a backhanded compliment. I didn't know how to respond, but I listened intently as she continued. "You probably don't realize this, but as you began to change, I changed too. I went from thinking you wouldn't last to being your biggest cheerleader. I watched as you started those nighttime runs in the desert, and I noticed you lifting weights too. That's why I was there the other night when you overdid it. Most people who lose as much weight as you have, especially when they haven't gotten into nearly the shape you're in, feel fulfilled and happy. They gain confidence, proud of their achievements. You, though? You don't seem happy at all." Her words cut deep. I had come to this camp to transform my life, to reclaim my sense of self, but was I truly happy? It felt like a slap in the face when she added, "You are almost the opposite of everyone else. Most people arrive sad and depressed, weighed down by their excess baggage, and when they lose some weight, they find a new lease on life. But you..." She paused, searching my eyes for something. "You're different. You've accomplished so much, yet you seem burdened. It's almost like you're carrying the weight of your past with you still." I stood there, feeling the weight of her words settle on my shoulders. What was it that I really wanted? What was holding me back? Maybe I had made significant strides, but I still felt like I was missing something essential. As I watched her gaze drift back to the canyon, I knew I had to confront whatever it was that kept me from embracing this new chapter of my life. The road ahead was challenging, but maybe it was time to truly let go of the past and start living for myself. They come here feeling happy, ready to go home more confident than ever. Sure, you might have arrived a little angry, but deep down, you were secure in yourself. You worked hard, pushing through every challenge, and your progress has been remarkable, more than I can remember from anyone else. You look fantastic, but it breaks my heart to see how much sadder and more withdrawn you've become. You used to sit in the back, laughing with everyone, and you radiated joy. Now, you've turned inward, spending more time alone in your workouts, even as you inspire so many campers and staff. James, I know what people think about me. I've heard all the nicknames, and honestly, I don't care. For me, this is just a job. My role is to help people discover the strength within themselves to change their health and their lives. That's all there is to it, Debbie said, her voice steady. I push them to transform, to embrace change, and I try to lead by example. Some get it, and some don't, but it's never personal. It's just a job. But over the past couple of months, you've become so much more to me than just another client. That's why I snapped at you the other night. When I saw that bar coming down on you, it terrified me. I thought you could have been seriously hurt. And, in a twisted way, I worried that maybe you wanted it to happen. I was taken aback by her words. There was a vulnerability in her confession that struck a chord within me. Without thinking, I reached out and hugged her tightly. She seemed to need this moment of connection, so I just listened as she opened up about her life. What she shared was far from what I had expected. I started out competing in gymnastics, she began, her eyes reflecting memories both painful and empowering. But I never had the short, muscular build typical of competitive gymnasts. I got injured often, and I watched as many of my peers took drugs, cocktails that delayed the onset of breast development and widening hips. I didn't go that route, and it quickly became clear that no matter how hard I worked, I was falling behind the girls who were using. They seemed invincible, while I was left struggling. She paused, her gaze distant, lost in thought. Eventually, I made the tough decision to walk away from gymnastics. It broke my heart, but I switched to a different sport. I was always pretty, so I decided to try fitness competitions. It was similar to bodybuilding, but the focus was on femininity and grace, rather than sheer size. I excelled, but the drugs crept back in. The women who won weren't just working hard, they were giving judges and sponsors extra incentives to get ahead. A shadow passed over her face. I was almost at my breaking point when I ended up in a dangerous situation. I was nearly eaten alive by an eating disorder, but I screamed loud enough that the security team rushed in to help. That was my wake-up call. I had to quit fitness competitions, too. I went back to school, got my degrees in exercise physiology and kinesiology, and I found my passion as a personal trainer. I've been working at this camp for 6 years now. After hearing her story, I felt a deep connection to Debbie, more than I'd felt with anyone in a long time. So I opened up about my own struggles. I came to this camp because of my wife, Sarah. She was embarrassed by me, wanted to send me away so she could cheat on me with someone in better shape. Debbie looked at me with a mix of empathy and understanding. She won't be embarrassed by you anymore, she said softly. The next time she sees you, she'll be all over you. I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. No, Debbie. The next time she sees me, it'll probably be in divorce court. I struggled to view things from her perspective, but hearing Debbie's story made me realize that sometimes, the path to healing means confronting our deepest fears and insecurities, whether we're ready or not. I had to admit it, I'd let myself go. Sarah was absolutely right to want me to get in better shape. But the way she approached it, the hurtful things she said, made me question if she ever truly cared about me. The cheating? That was the last straw. I might have been able to forgive the other stuff in time, but I knew I'd never trust her again. That night had changed everything. From then on, I committed to Debbie's class every day, and she pushed me harder than ever. I could see the jealousy in the eyes of the other guys when they watched me do push-ups with Debbie sitting on my back. It was all in good fun, of course. She even joined me for late-night runs. While we never crossed any lines, sometimes her gaze lingered on me in a way that sent shivers down my spine. Meanwhile, things were getting messy at home. According to the private investigator, Sarah had broken things off with her old college fling. He'd been using her for sex, practically living in our house, and even his wife was starting to raise eyebrows. Their relationship had soured, and after a fight between them, Sarah was trying to end things. She began calling me more often, leaving messages filled with declarations of how much she missed and loved me. Since the camp was scheduled to close for about a month at the end of the season, I knew I'd have to head home soon. On a shopping trip with Debbie, because I desperately needed new clothes after losing nearly 140 pounds, I stumbled upon something I had always dreamed of but could never afford, a bright red 2009 Mustang GT. It was sitting on a car lot across from the mall, and I felt a rush of excitement as I approached it. The door was open, so I climbed inside. Just over 100 pounds ago, I could barely fit in my old, beat-up car. Now, I slid into the Mustang with ease. It felt like a triumph. I found a salesman, and we started the paperwork. After he ran my credit and I arranged a transfer from my account, I drove off the lot, exhilarated in my new ride. Debbie followed me back to the camp in her Jeep, probably wondering what I'd do next. Once I was back, I made a few phone calls to my PI and my lawyer, informing them about the upcoming ceremony for the campers and making sure the divorce papers were ready to be delivered to me at the camp. Then I called Sarah to let her know that the camp would be wrapping up soon and there would be a ceremony for families and friends. She sounded excited when I told her I'd see her soon, but I warned her not to get her hopes too high. "This may not be a happy occasion for you," I said, and her response surprised me. "James, over the past few months, I've realized looks aren't everything. What matters is being with someone who loves and supports you, no matter what they weigh or how they look. Even if you've only lost 1 pound, it's time for you to come home so we can move on with our lives. I love you and I miss you. I've had a lot of time to think about what I really want and need in my life. I miss my big, strong teddy bear of a husband." As the call ended, I couldn't shake the feeling that she had no idea how much I had changed, how far I had come. The man she thought she knew was no longer there. I was starting a new chapter, and I wasn't going to let her dictate my story anymore. I knew about her infidelity, but she kept acting like everything was normal between us. I didn't say anything, either. Over the next few days, I took some significant steps to change my life and my job, and some of those moves I kept entirely to myself, even from Debbie. Debbie was a different story altogether. As the ceremony approached, she became needier and clingier. The night before the big event, we shared dinner, and I made a point to thank her for all the support and inspiration she had given me. It felt intimate. She even held my hand for a while as we talked. "I guess our time together is running out," she said softly. "Your wife will be at the ceremony, and soon you'll be heading back to Ohio to either put her in her place or get a divorce." All I could muster was a quiet, "Yeah." I missed the sadness in her tone, my mind preoccupied with everything else swirling around in my head. We drove back to camp in silence, and there were so many unresolved feelings between us. After a moment, she broke the quiet. "I know you're too honorable to even consider starting a relationship while you're still married. But I have to ask, have you made up your mind about your wife? Is there a chance I might get a plane ticket to Ohio soon?" "Debbie," I replied, feeling the weight of honesty between us. "We've always been upfront with each other. And whether you realize it or not, I have deep feelings for you. So I won't start lying now. I can't say if a ticket to Ohio is in my future, but it's not a bad idea." She nodded, her expression unreadable, and I didn't see her again until the ceremony the next day. That morning, I woke up early and went for my run. For most of the campers, the weeks or months of hard work and dieting were over, but for me, running had become part of who I was. Just because I didn't have to do it didn't mean I'd skip it. After my run, I searched for Debbie, but she was nowhere to be found. Some staff members mentioned that she was holed up in her quarters, feeling unwell. I also heard that Sarah was looking for me around the complex. In a moment of mischief, I headed to the auditorium to see if I could find her. When I spotted her, I walked right by, and she didn't even recognize me. I made sure the messenger was around, and when I caught his eye, I signaled to him that I would call for him when the time was right. He nodded in understanding. Once the ceremony started, everyone filed into the auditorium, and to my surprise, I saw Debbie standing not far from Sarah. It was an interesting sight, and I couldn't help but compare the two. It was like comparing apples to oranges. Sarah had short blonde hair and a tall, slender frame. She was pretty but didn't have Debbie's stunning beauty. Debbie, while shorter, had a magnetic allure that was hard to ignore. I noticed Debbie talking to someone, and it seemed she was discussing me. Sarah must have overheard, because she suddenly became flustered and retreated from the table, choosing to sit down. When our eyes met, I smiled at her, but she quickly turned away. I couldn't help but chuckle. She must have thought I was just some random guy trying to flirt with her. For months, she'd been dating my old college buddy Thomas, even bringing him to my house and sharing my bed. Yet here she was, acting all innocent, avoiding a stranger's smile. As the ceremony unfolded, I found myself wrapped in a mix of emotions, watching both women navigate their own worlds while I tried to figure out mine. Every glance, every whispered conversation, felt like a thread pulling tighter, weaving a complex tapestry of love, betrayal, and choices yet to be made. As I stood there on the stage, the excitement in the air was palpable. The moment my name echoed through the hall, I saw Sarah turn, her eyes wide with disbelief as she tried to process the transformation. I walked up to collect my awards, heart pounding in my chest. I had achieved so much during my time at the camp, one award for most pounds lost in a single month, another for the largest overall weight loss, and finally, the most inspirational camper award. I felt a rush of pride as I stood there, a man reborn. I had entered that camp completely out of shape, and now, thanks to hard work and determination, I had not only shed a significant amount of weight but had also revamped my entire lifestyle. As I scanned the audience, I caught Sarah sitting on the edge of her seat, her mouth slightly agape. The disbelief in her eyes was unmistakable. It was as if she couldn't fathom that the husband she had known, the man who once weighed nearly 430 pounds, was now standing confidently before her. When I was asked to say a few words, I seized the moment. I spoke about my journey, the sleepless nights, the sweat-drenched workouts, the emotional battles, and the inspiration I drew from those around me, including Debbie, who had been a constant support. I then invited her on stage to acknowledge her role in my transformation, and as the applause erupted, it felt like the culmination of all my hard work. Debbie joined me, and I could feel the warmth of the audience enveloping us. But then, as she walked past Sarah, I felt the tension in the room spike. Sarah's glare could have cut through glass. If looks could kill, Debbie would have been done for. Still, I was riding high on my achievements and momentarily dismissed the discomfort. After the ceremony concluded and everyone began to filter out for dinner, I stood there basking in the glow of my accomplishments. A few minutes later, however, I felt the air shift. I sensed Sarah approaching, her face a storm cloud of anger and betrayal. "No wonder you wanted to stay up here for so long," she exclaimed, marching toward me and Debbie. "You just wanted to betray me with this woman while I waited at home." "Sarah, let's just take a breath," I said, trying to maintain my composure. "Debbie and I are just friends. There's nothing going on between us. So before you make a scene, why don't you just take a moment to collect yourself?" Her expression softened slightly, and she replied, "I'm sorry. It's just. You look incredible. You're so slim and different. I guess I'm just feeling jealous. I've been so lonely in that house, waiting for you. I can't wait to get home and try out this new you." I raised an eyebrow, surprised at her admission. "So you've been lonely, huh?" I asked, my tone skeptical. I pulled out my phone and showed her a photo of her with Thomas at a restaurant. "And who is this guy you've been out with?" "Oh, he's just an old college friend I ran into," she replied, brushing it off as if it were nothing. "Nothing?" I shot back, my anger rising. "He's something, and he's the reason we're getting a divorce. I know everything about him, Sarah. I know you started seeing him before I even left for the camp. You wanted me to go because you were embarrassed to be seen with your fat husband who loved you wholeheartedly, but you were off with someone who looked better." Her face shifted from defensive to a mix of shock and anger. "That's not fair," she exclaimed. "Fair?" I echoed, incredulous. "I have you on record saying it. I've got photos of you bringing him into our house, our home, where you were intimate in my bed. So what else is there to say?" I turned to leave, feeling a sense of finality wash over me. I gestured to my lawyer's messenger, who stepped forward and handed Sarah the divorce papers. Her eyes widened in disbelief, and panic flickered across her face. "James, we can talk about this," she pleaded, her voice cracking. I shook my head firmly. "It's over, Sarah. This wasn't just a fling, it was a choice you made, and now we're both paying the price." As I walked away, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I had spent so long trapped in a cycle of guilt and heartbreak, but now I was ready to focus on my own future. The journey to reclaim my life had begun, and I was determined to embrace it fully. Driving home that night, I reflected on the whirlwind of emotions that had just unfolded. The highs of the awards, the sharp lows of Sarah's betrayal, it was all so overwhelming. But in that chaos, I felt a new clarity. This was my moment to rewrite my story, to redefine who I was. I could no longer be defined by my past mistakes or my relationship with Sarah. I was James, a man who had faced his demons and emerged stronger. As the city lights flickered past my car window, I realized that this was just the beginning. A fresh start awaited me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about what lay ahead. I was ready to embrace my new life, one filled with possibilities, without the shadow of betrayal hanging over me. I ended it on my own terms because, truth be told, I missed you. After all this time, I finally came to my senses and realized that I do love you. We share so much more in common than anyone else I know. The only thing I didn't like about you was your weight, but that's a thing of the past now. Sarah, I guess we both came to our senses, I replied, my voice steady but edged with emotion. When I found out about your fling, it hit me hard. I realized I didn't want to be married to someone who was embarrassed by me. The thrill of being your husband faded the moment I overheard what you said behind my back. And you're right about one thing, we do have a lot in common. You were ashamed to be seen with a heavy guy, so you sent me away. Now, I'm embarrassed to be with a cheater, so it's time for you to go. Her eyes widened with disbelief, and I could see the panic rising in her. James, we can get past this. Just come home. We'll talk it out, go through counseling. We have too much history to throw it all away, she pleaded, her voice cracking with desperation. I shook my head slowly. It's already settled. We live in a no-fault state, so the judge will insist on a 50-50 split of our assets. We don't have kids, so there's nothing to fight over. Our house makes up about 70% of our net worth, and I'm leaving that to you. You'll walk away with a better settlement than you'd get from the courts. Just walk away, and we'll both come out ahead. At least you'll be better off than I am right now. I'm currently homeless. Tears welled in her eyes, and for a moment, I almost felt a twinge of sympathy. But where will you live? Why don't you stay with me? Let me make it up to you. Sarah, you haven't cared about me since the moment you started your little affair. I don't know why you suddenly care now, but I refuse to go back to that house. That's why I gave it to you. I'm starting my life over with someone who won't be ashamed of me. I lost over 140 pounds while I was here, but you lost a husband who would have loved you forever, a beautiful home, and a family we could have had, all because you wanted to have fun. My weight was just an excuse for you to justify your affair. If you ask me, you're the real winner here. With that, I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving her standing there, tears streaming down her cheeks. The finality of it all settled heavily in the air between us. After that conversation, all communication went through our lawyers until the divorce was finalized. I received a phone call from her father a few weeks later. He sounded genuinely worried about how miserable she was and asked if I'd consider visiting to clear the air. It forced me to lay out the details of our breakup, recounting the pain I felt and the betrayal that shattered our marriage. When I offered to send him proof, pictures, audio recordings, even video, he just sighed and told me to have a nice life. I took his advice graciously and focused on moving forward. Sarah didn't cause any trouble during the divorce proceedings, everything went smoothly. Occasionally, we'd touch base, but it was nothing serious. It felt surreal, knowing that someone I had once shared so much with was now just a distant memory. Meanwhile, I began a new chapter with Debbie. We had met during a community event, and our connection was instant. As we acted on our feelings, I found myself laughing more, enjoying life in a way I hadn't in years. Life with her was vibrant and fulfilling, and everyone in my family, friends, and colleagues was astonished at the transformation, not just in my body but in my spirit. They adored Debbie, often telling me I'd made the right decision. It felt like a weight had been lifted, and I was finally free to be myself. Sarah sold the house and moved in with her parents. It wasn't long before I heard that she found another guy, and from what I gathered, she was piling on the pounds again. Out of a sense of goodwill, I sent her a brochure for the fitness boot camp I had attended. I genuinely wanted to help her, after all, it had worked wonders for me. I even offered to cover the cost, hoping she might take the chance to reclaim her health. But sadly, she declined. Months passed, and life continued to unfold. Debbie and I traveled, went on hikes, and shared countless adventures that filled my heart with joy. I felt stronger than ever, not just physically but emotionally. I realized that moving on from Sarah had been one of the best decisions I'd ever made. I had found a partner who accepted me for who I was, without judgment or shame. As for Sarah, I hoped she would find her way, even if it meant struggling a bit. I wanted her to understand the importance of self-love and acceptance. But I couldn't dwell on it. I had my own life to live now, one filled with love, laughter, and endless possibilities. I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey I had been on, for the lessons learned, and for the new beginning I had embraced. In the end, life had a way of surprising us, of teaching us in the most unexpected ways. I had emerged from the ashes of my past, ready to embrace whatever the future held. And for that, I was endlessly thankful.